I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 21. Texas Invasion. Gulf of Mexico, near Corpus Christi, Texas. Beads of sweat formed on Staff Sergeant Haverty's face as he finished his set of reps on the bench press. He sat up, and the sweat ran down his face until it dripped off his chin. Haverty stood and took the weights off the bar, placing them back where they belonged. "It feels good to get a decent workout in," he thought. India Company had been back on the USS Baton now for a few days as they made their way to the next battlefield. While they had a few days on the ship, Haverty was taking advantage of the gym on the ship. He was running the guys in his platoon through it as well. It was important to stay physically fit and let off some steam. The Cuba campaign had been a tough fight, and the Marines had largely been on their own for most of it. A Florida Army National Guard brigade had come to help them towards the end of the campaign, but it had largely been a Marine fight. Now the Guard was staying behind to garrison the island nation, while the Marines moved to the next major battle. As he finished placing the last of his weights away, Haverty saw one of the elliptical machines open up, and he made a beeline for it. After cranking the resistance all the way up, he started moving as fast and as hard as he could. His thighs were burning, but he didn't care. The harder he worked them now, the less they'd hurt when he was packed down with body armor and weapons. Haverty looked up at the TV that was airing AFN and saw that the show that was on had just ended. Now one of the AFN newscasters came on to bring them the hourly news. As Haverty listened, the commentator spoke about some massive battle taking place against several U.S. positions in California, where the PLA forces sought to break out of the state. As the broadcast continued, Haverty's attention shifted much more to what the commentator was saying and less on his burning thighs. He knew his fellow Marine brothers were really the ones keeping the Chinese bottled up in California. The commentator went on for a while about the heavy fighting in the Sequoia National Forest, highlighting some sort of new terror drone the Chinese had just integrated into their units. He briefly mentioned casualties, but stopped short of listing how many service members had been killed or wounded. "That means the death toll is high, and the government just doesn't want to disclose the actual number yet," he thought. Over the course of the war, Haverty had learned to read between the lines of what was told to the public and what was being said inside military circles. The commentator spoke for another 10 minutes before they did a quick wrap-up of what was going on around the world and in the United States. When the news was done, AFN put on a rerun of Family Guy, a cartoon Haverty found both stupid and funny. After 20 minutes on the elliptical, Staff Sergeant Haverty finished his workout and made his way over to the shower room. He turned on the water and just let it run across his body. It felt good to have running water again, to really scrub himself down in soap and know he had enough water to get it all off. It was even better knowing he had time to do all this and didn't have to worry about some sniper shooting at him or a random mortar attack. While many of the Russian and Cuban forces had surrendered a few weeks ago, some of the more radical units of the Cuban military had been a little more reluctant to accept the end of the communist regime. Some of those die-hard holdouts had cost Haverty's unit a few KIAs. Once the war in Cuba was over, Haverty and his men had been placed on occupation duty. It should have been a low-risk assignment, but several of his Marines had been killed in action, including their platoon sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Mann. That guy had survived so much death and killing, only to get taken out by a random mortar round. When his shower was done, Haverty got dressed. He made his way to their training room to see what the lieutenant had in mind for the day's training. Until a replacement showed up, Haverty was filling in as the platoon sergeant. When Haverty entered the room, their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Wallace, spotted him right away. "Ah, there you are, Staff Sergeant," he called. Wallace was a well-liked commander. He'd been an enlisted guy before he became an officer, so he seemed to have a special affinity for his NCOs that not all officers shared. Haverty stood at ease and smiled. "Yes, sir. Just running my guys through the gym and having everyone get a solid workout before our next mission. Well, this afternoon we're going to do a quick awards and promotion ceremony in the hangar bay," Wallace announced. "It's been 6 months since we last held one of these, and it's time we get our paperwork caught back up and make sure our Marines are getting recognized. I mentioned that we have a lot of promotions to hand out as well. This last campaign was tough on our regiment, and the MEF in general. We may not be slugging it out against the Chinese like our brothers on the West Coast, but we've taken our own licks." Haverty nodded solemnly. "Your company in particular took a lot of hits, Gunnery Sergeant Mann being the most recent one," said Wallace somberly. After a pause, out of respect, he continued. "First Lieutenant Lacey here is going to take over as the company CO. He's being promoted to captain this afternoon. That means we're going to be short 2 gunnery sergeants and 3 lieutenants in the unit. I asked the lieutenant here who he'd like to recommend to fill some of these positions. Now, before word gets out, I want you to know that we considered picking you to replace Gunny Mann, but in the end, we opted not to." Haverty's heart sank. He was almost angry at being passed over. He'd done everything right. He had a perfect record in the Corps thus far. Wallace must have seen the look of disappointment on his face, because he quickly added, "Lieutenant Lacey said you were far too qualified to fill Mann's position. He said your leadership skills in the platoon are beyond reproach, and you'd make an exceptional platoon leader. As such, this afternoon, you'll be given a battlefield promotion to 2nd lieutenant." Haverty was taken aback. He hadn't expected that. He'd hoped to make gunny during the next selection period, and would focus on moving up to 1st sergeant and then maybe sergeant major before he retired. But a direct promotion to lieutenant? That opened up a whole new career track for him. "You've earned it, Staff Sergeant. I couldn't think of a better man to lead the platoon I'm leaving," Lieutenant Lacey said as he extended his hand. Haverty shook hands with the lieutenant and Wallace before they filled him in on who else was getting promoted and some of the awards. Everyone in his platoon was getting a Naval Commendation Medal with Valor device, along with a newly created Cuban Campaign Medal. 9 of his guys were getting a Purple Heart, 8 were getting Bronze Stars with V devices, and 4 were getting Silver Stars. One of his guys had been put in for and was going to receive the Navy Cross. Before Haverty was left to go inform his platoon of the afternoon awards and promotion ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel Wallace leaned in. "I wanted to be the one to tell you I've personally recommended you for a Silver Star for your actions during the Blitz on Havana. You saved a lot of guys when you led that charge into that village and took that machine gunner out. You earned that medal. Now go get your guys ready for this afternoon." Haverty left the room feeling like he was walking on a cloud. He was being promoted to lieutenant. He was losing one of his staff sergeants to another platoon, but he was also gaining 12 new Marines, fresh from training. Many of his Marines were getting a 1-grade promotion as well. He felt good that his first act as lieutenant was going to be promoting many of his Marines and presenting them with their awards. They've earned it, he thought. They all have. 3 days later, off the coast of Brownsville, Texas. Lieutenant Haverty's platoon was loaded up in 2 of the V-22 Ospreys on the flight deck, along with 2 of the newly issued robotic big dogs. As the engines spun up, Haverty felt a heightened sense of uncertainty. The engines hit a new pitch, and the rotors picked up more speed. Soon, the tilt-rotor aircraft lifted off the flight deck of the Baton. It gained altitude and moved away from the task force of amphibious assault ships and guided missile destroyers. Looking out the rear of the aircraft, Haverty saw a mix of landing crafts, LCACs, LCMs, and LCUs, all disembarking from their motherships to begin the process of ferrying the Marines' vehicles and other heavy equipment to shore. It was official. The men of the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit were finally going to join the fight against the Chinese that had invaded their country. Steadily, the Ospreys gained altitude until they were flying around 4,000 feet above the water. Their attack helicopters, the venerable Super Cobra gunships, flew below and in front of them. Above and in front of them were the MEU's Harrier jets, which would swoop in and pulverize whatever the Marines directed them to. This was a full-court combined arms attack deep behind enemy lines. The MEU's objective was to liberate Naval Air Station Corpus Christi and the surrounding area. Once they had captured the naval base and the city, the rest of 2nd MEF would pour into Texas, and they'd begin their offensive to liberate San Antonio and lift the siege of Houston. It was a gamble sending the Marines in. The PLA had just transferred 8 divisions of fresh troops to Texas in hopes of finally achieving a breakout. 10 minutes into their flight, the Ospreys began to fly a lot closer to the water. They also banked from right to left, taking evasive maneuvers as the coast neared. Eventually, the Air Armada swung around towards the old abandoned airfield at Walden Field. Looking out the rear of the aircraft, Haverty saw strings of tracer fire flying up to meet them from NAS Corpus Christi. He watched as a couple of missiles flew in from the Harriers as they tried to silence some of the AA guns. "Here we go," shouted the crew chief near the rear of the aircraft. The Osprey flared up slightly as it bled off some speed, and then they gently set down on the abandoned runway. "Go, go, go!" Haverty yelled to his Marines as they all ran off the Osprey. They immediately took a defensive position. Not seeing any urgent threats around them, Haverty shouted at his Marines to form up and move out to their objective. His platoon had been charged with the South Gate entrance and the surrounding area. The rest of the company would then move in and capture the rest of the airfield. While their company was completing these tasks, the rest of the battalion would capture the international airport in town and the port facilities. Then the rest of their gear and their reinforcements would start to arrive, and they'd mop up whatever resistance remained in the city. "Let's move!" Haverty shouted, pointing to where he wanted his squads to go. They were slated to travel down Waldron Road, which was a 3.5-kilometer straight shot to their objective. Haverty didn't think it should take them more than 25 minutes to get there, assuming they didn't meet any resistance. As his platoon moved onto the road, Haverty split them up, so he had 2 squads on each side of the street. They all kept their heads on a swivel, especially considering the occasional explosion they'd hear coming from the base. The sounds of AA fire slowly faded away as more of the enemy gun positions were taken out. Seeing the plumes of black smoke rising over the quintessential American city was a strange experience for Haverty and the rest of the Marines. Thus far, all of their fighting had been in the Caribbean, not in American cities and the countryside, like so many of the other military units in the war. As they continued moving down the road at a good clip, some of the people that lived in the houses and worked the businesses along the road came out to greet them. Many of the men and women cried. Some of them walked up to the Marines and tried to shake their hands. A few of the women even tried to give them a hug. It was a surreal scene unfolding around them. More and more civilians came out to greet them, looking skinny and emaciated. This wasn't something Haverty had expected, and he was almost at a loss as to what to do or how to respond. Clearly their countrymen had been through hell, and now they felt like their saviors had finally arrived. But Haverty had a mission to complete. He couldn't just stop. "Keep moving, Marines, keep moving. We have to hit our objective in 20 mics," he shouted, loud enough for his guys to hear him, and hopefully some of the civilians too. He hoped they'd get the message and try to stay out of their way. Then he heard the sound of a helicopter coming from the direction of the base. Looking to where the noise was coming from, Haverty spotted a lone helicopter lifting off and heading toward them. That doesn't look friendly, he realized. The helicopter was practically on top of them when it angled its nose down, which meant it was getting ready to start shooting. Haverty's new platoon sergeant started barking out orders, and his Marines scattered to either side of the road, looking for some cover. The civilians sensed the danger, and they too ran to hide. Then the helicopter's chin gun opened fire. Parts of the paved road they'd been walking on exploded from the impact of the machine gun bullets. A couple of Haverty's M240G gunners returned fire on the helicopter as it neared them. Probably 24 other Marines joined in sending as much hot lead at the helicopter as they could. The helicopter flew past them unhindered, as if it could shrug off the bullets. Instead of turning back to attack Haverty's platoon, the gunship fired off some rockets at one of the other platoons. Haverty heard more gunfire from their comrades as the helicopter flew near them. So far, none of the platoons had managed to shoot it down with their rifles or machine guns. That meant the helicopter was probably armored. Haverty was about to call out for his RTO so he could place a callback to the fleet for some air support to take it out, when a missile streaked through the sky, obliterating the enemy helicopter. Either someone else had beat him to the punch, or they already had a fighter loitering nearby. In either case, the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Keep moving!" shouted his platoon sergeant. The Marines got back up and continued their advance to the base. When they neared the facility, a few of the men spotted something and signaled for everyone to take cover. Haverty made his way over to the platoon sergeant and their point man. "What we got, fellas?" he asked. His gunnery sergeant pointed to a spot near the gate. "Looks like a couple of APCs and at least 2 squads of soldiers," he explained. "Judging by their uniforms, I'd make them out to be PLA naval infantry." "Okay, Gunny. I want you to take first squad and move around into the woods near that power transmission lot," said Lieutenant Haverty. He pulled out a map. "See if a couple of our guys with our SMAWs can take out those armored vehicles. Once you do, we'll engage them from this position over here." He pointed to a couple of positions on the map. His gunny nodded and motioned for first squad to follow him as they took off to get in position. Haverty directed the other squads to fan out along a couple of the side roads about a block away from the main gate. This would place them a few hundred meters from the PLA soldiers, ready to assist first squad as they engaged them. 5 minutes went by, and the tension of what was about to happen grew. Haverty got a short message, letting him know first squad was ready to start things on their end. He gave them the go-ahead. A second later, 2 rockets flew out from the woods to their right and slammed into the 2 armored personnel carriers. The missiles blew the armored vehicles apart. The enemy soldiers took cover and fired into the tree line where the rockets had come from. Haverty signaled his other squad leaders to start firing. The rest of the platoon's Marines and machine gunners opened fire on the enemy soldiers who were shooting at first squad. They had the Chinese soldiers caught in a halfway decent crossfire. In seconds, they had cut down nearly half of the defenders. A couple of civilian trucks drove toward them with additional soldiers in the back bay. The Marines turned their guns on the 2 trucks and riddled them with bullets. The drivers must have been hit because both vehicles spun off the road and rolled out. Whatever soldiers weren't injured or killed after the accidents used the crashed trucks for cover and returned fire on the Marines. "Second squad, move!" shouted one of Haverty's squad leaders. The 13 Marines jumped up and bounded toward the enemy position, while the other squads laid down suppressive fire. Haverty dashed forward with them, firing off a couple of shots at the Chinese soldiers. A couple of bullets zipped past his head. He'd nearly made it to the next covered position when a Marine to his right was shot in both of his legs. The guy went down hard. Haverty stopped next to the Marine and aimed at a PLA soldier that was still shooting at them. He squeezed the trigger of his M27 and let loose a 3-second burst of automatic fire into the Chinese soldier. The man staggered backward as a series of rounds slammed into the guy's chest plate. He went down and didn't appear to be getting up. Lieutenant Haverty looked down at his wounded Marine. The wound in his left leg looked to be a bit more urgent. Spurts of blood squirted out with each heartbeat. Haverty knew if he didn't stop the bleeder, the guy would be dead before he pulled him back to cover. He placed his rifle on the ground, reached down, grabbed the tourniquet from the man's chest rig, and got it situated on his left leg. Then he tightened the strap until the blood stopped squirting out. "Hang on," he told the Marine. Haverty picked his rifle back up, grabbed the drag handle behind the man's body armor, and started pulling him to cover. One of the Navy corpsmen ran up to them and immediately started working on the Marine's other leg. With his wounded trooper taken care of, Haverty scanned the area to see what enemy soldiers were still left. At this point, it looked like only a few of them were still shooting at his men. By now, First Squad had bounded forward and was almost to the burning wrecks of the Chinese APCs. The 3 remaining PLA soldiers threw their weapons down and held up their hands to surrender. Haverty's platoon sergeant was closest to them, so he ran forward with several Marines. They kicked the soldiers' rifles away and zip-tied their hands behind their backs. While First Squad was securing the 3 prisoners, Haverty called out for the rest of his platoon. "Follow me! We're going to advance to the base and help secure it." He left First Squad and his platoon sergeant at the south gate. A medevac helicopter would come in and pick up their wounded. The other platoons from the company had moved forward and had fanned out as everyone advanced on the Naval Air Station. Steadily, the Marines advanced through the base, clearing building after building. Then they progressed to the airfield and cleared the hangars and everything else. By mid-afternoon, they had secured the entire air station. A steady stream of Marine and Navy helicopters flew in from the fleet, bringing mechanics, munitions, and additional fuel for the attack helicopters. Their helicopters would be relocated from the ships offshore to the Naval Air Station so they could provide faster support to the ground units. As Lieutenant Haverty's platoon and company secured the air station, the rest of the battalion had come ashore at Breaker Avenue Beach Park and air assaulted into the international airport. By the time the sun set that day, they had 1,500 Marines on land. The city of Corpus Christi, Texas, was officially liberated. Chapter 22. Sea Trials. January 2022. Hampton Roads, Virginia. Vice Admiral Ingalls stood under the open-air tent, along with dozens of other naval officers and senior enlisted personnel in their dress-white uniforms, waiting for the ceremony to get started. The Secretary of the Navy, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Chief of Naval Operations, and even the President were in attendance for the christening of America's newest warships. The group was filled with hope that these warships would forever change the landscape of naval warfare. Sachs walked to the lectern and made some brief remarks about American ingenuity and how these 2 warships represented the very essence of the country. Admiral Ingalls wasn't so sure about that, but he did have to admit these warships were by far the most advanced warships to have ever put to sea. When the President was done with his speech, a few others came forward and gave their own remarks. Admiral Ingalls felt that the worst of the speeches were from the senators and members of Congress. They liked to go on and on about how they'd fought tooth and nail to get these ships funded and built. In reality, Ingalls knew they'd had no idea these ships were even being constructed until well after the war had broken out. Now they were all lining up and trying to do whatever they could to be a part of the project that was being hailed as the superweapon that would win the war. When the ceremony neared the final moment of christening the ship, Vice Admiral Ingalls was asked to come forward and give a brief speech. He stood and made his way over to the lectern, surveying those in attendance. When he reached his post, he noted the position of the TV cameras and made sure to speak to them and not the crowd. This thing should never have been televised, he thought. He'd advocated keeping the launch of the ships under wraps, but ultimately his advice had been shot down. Ingalls took a deep breath and stood tall as he began his speech. Today marks the first day in a new and dangerous evolution in warfare. The ship behind me is the culmination of nearly 100 years of lessons learned in naval combat. It incorporates the latest in scientific breakthroughs and cutting-edge technology. This ship and her sister ship will not only win this war, they will allow the United States to project power well beyond our shores for generations to come. These two ships represent the newest warships in America's arsenal of freedom, the Manhattan-class arsenal ship. I won't go into the exact specifications of what this warship is capable of, but suffice it to say, its technology and weapon systems are unlike any ever seen before. It relegates all other warships, including our current inventory of ships, to the ash heaps of history. With that said, I welcome the First Lady to officially christen first of the Arsenal-class ships, the USS Warhammer and the USS Spartan. The people in attendance stood and clapped as the First Lady stepped forward and did the honors, breaking a bottle of champagne against the bow of the massive warship. 2 weeks later. Vice Admiral Ingalls stood on the bridge of the USS Warhammer as the ship prepared to fire its vertical launch missiles for the first time. He wanted to make sure they had the conventional system operational before they moved on to the next generation weapons. The visitors to the ship stood on the bridge along with the ship's captain, watching the bow of the ship where the missile pods were positioned. A minute later, the first missile fired straight up into the air before its rocket motor directed it off towards its target. 60 seconds after the first missile fired, a second one emerged from the same pod. The reusable VLS tube had successfully proven it could fire a missile, reload a new one from its magazine, and fire again. Developing a reloadable VLS system meant the ship could carry a large number of missiles without having to obscure a large portion of the deck space with missile pods. Instead, the front of the ship had been outfitted with 100 reloadable missile pods. The magazine well could hold an additional 1,200 missiles, ranging from SM-2s, SM-3s, SM-4s, and SM-6s to Tomahawk cruise missiles. Behind the VLS pods, the turrets housed the dual-barrel 16-inch railguns. The turrets were dome-shaped, allowing more room for the barrels to elevate to a higher angle. This enabled the gun to arc its projectiles to hit more distant targets. To the rear of the turrets, the phased array radar and tracking system allowed the battleship to find, identify, and engage hostile targets. This part of the ship looked like an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. To the rear of the forward section sat 2 structures on either side of the ship, the direct energy weapon pods. Having them situated on either side of the ship and at different positions allowed them to provide an exceptional bubble of protection. They could both be brought to bear against a host of targets and angle low enough that they could engage smaller ships or boats that might try to get close to the Warhammer's hull. Also along the sides of the ship were 4 turrets, 2 on each side. These turrets consisted of dual 50-caliber railguns designed specifically to engage enemy aircraft, missiles, and UAVs. They were the ship's point defense systems, should a hostile threat enter the Warhammer's protective bubble. A 2-lane flight deck protruded from the sides of the ship like a 25-degree angled V. Like the Ford-class carriers, this ship would also use a magnetic catapult system, eliminating the need for a steam-generated system. To the rear of the flight deck was a fairly large rear parking ramp. There was also a large hangar that connected to the superstructure, which would house the ship's helicopters. To the rear of the parking ramp were 2 large elevators that connected the flight deck with the hangar deck below. From all outward appearances, the Arsenal ships looked like a cross between an Arleigh Burke destroyer, a World War II battleship, and a supercarrier. They were towering giants with 18 decks, stretching 1,106 feet in length and 134 feet in width. Most of the ship's internal guts housed the missile magazines and the aircraft. The unique thing about having the flight deck split in a V shape was that it allowed the ship to launch either 4 aircraft at a time or recover 2 aircraft at a time. They could also recover aircraft on one side while launching them on the other. It really changed the way a carrier could operate. However, the landing was going to require some new training, especially because the ship would be launching fighters at the same time. While the Arsenal ships weren't primarily intended to be aircraft carriers, they did have a hangar deck large enough to accommodate 27 aircraft, in addition to 6 helicopters. The Warhammer's air wing consisted of 16 F-35Cs, 4 EA-18G Growlers, 3 E-2 Hawkeyes, 4 MQ-25 Stingray UAVs, and 6 ASW SH-60 Seahawk helicopters. The complement of aircraft and helicopters allowed the ship to be a true multi-role, multi-purpose weapon platform for the 21st century. The first day of tests went by quickly, as the crew ran through the various system checks on the different weapon platforms. They identified glitches in the targeting software, ghost targets on the radar screens, and numerous other electrical, mechanical, and technological problems on the ship. However, by the end of the 5th day of sea trials, the engineers believed they'd found most of the issues that would need to get fixed. The air side of testing had also been completed, with only minor changes needing to be made. Most of the changes revolved around the pilots needing to learn how to land in the reverse direction of how they'd been doing it in the past. Now that the engineers had identified the various glitches and problems throughout the ship that needed to be worked on, they'd head back to port and spend the next few months running through each item, making sure they were fixed before they'd head out for their next battery of tests. Normally, this process could take the better part of a year and 3 or 4 tests at sea before they'd run it through a full shakedown cruise, but they didn't have that kind of time. They had less than 4 months to get her ready for war. Chapter 23. Recovery. Bethesda, Maryland. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Who's that voice belong to? Gunnery Sergeant Mack wondered. He could barely tell if the voice came from a woman or a man. Where the hell am I? He questioned why he couldn't see, and suddenly realized his eyes were closed. I need to open my eyes. Mack's eyes hurt. The lights seemed so bright. He raised his right hand to rub the crust that had formed around his eyes, and then used his hand to shield his eyes while they adjusted to the light. Steadily, his eyes began to focus. He saw that he was in some sort of hospital. He saw other beds with bodies lying in them nearby. A nurse walked by his bed. "Excuse me," he called out. "Where am I?" The woman, who was probably in her mid-20s, turned and smiled. then walked over to the side of his bed. "Gunnery Sergeant Mac, you're awake," she remarked. Her tone was filled with surprise and happiness. "I'm so glad you've woken up. I had to admit, we weren't sure if you were going to pull through when you came in." He tried to figure out how to respond. Yes, I'm awake," he stammered. "How long have I been out, and where am I?" "I'm sure you have a lot of questions, hon," she said with a smile. "I'll go get one of the doctors. He'll be able to explain more." Then she dashed off. Damn it. All I wanted was an answer to my question, he thought. As far as he was concerned, they could figure out the rest later. Mac turned to look around and take more of his surroundings in. He was obviously in some sort of big medical ward. There were 2 rows of 10 soldiers in this room. More than half of them appeared to be asleep. He couldn't tell what was wrong with them from where he was situated. A few minutes went by. Mac hoped someone would walk near his bed so he could try and call out to ask them some questions. While he waited, he did a quick mental check of his body. Clearly, he could move his arms and fingers. Next, he wiggled the toes on both feet before he tried moving his legs. Thankfully, everything seemed to be working, which was a huge relief. He'd heard horror stories of guys waking up and suddenly realizing they didn't have legs, or that they had some other terrible injury. He didn't seem to fit that description just yet. A doctor walked up to his bed and greeted him with a warm smile.
"Gunnery Sergeant, it's good to see you awake. I wasn't sure how long you'd be out."
Not wanting to waste time, Mac got down to business. "Thank you, Doc. Can you tell me where I am?" he asked. "How long have I been out? And what the hell happened to me in my unit?"
The doctor nodded. "You're at Walter Reed. You've been in a coma for nearly 2 months. As to what happened, you were shot in the chest multiple times. Fortunately, you only suffered a few broken ribs since your body armor stopped the rounds. However, you were also shot in the head. Your helmet absorbed most of the impact, but the bullet did penetrate the helmet, and it entered your head around this point here," he explained, gesturing. "We were lucky that the bullet stayed mostly above your brain and settled just under the skull. You had a lot of brain swelling during the first few days after you were medevaced. Eventually, they flew you here, and we opened your skull up and removed the bullet. Unfortunately, we had to put you in a medically induced coma to help reduce the brain swelling. That was 6 weeks ago."
Mac lay there stunned as he took all of the information in. It was a lot to digest. He'd been shot in the head and somehow survived. That was pretty impressive if he did say so himself. "Am I going to be okay?" he asked. "Is there anything else wrong with me?"
"You mean will you be able to go back to your unit?"
the doctor clarified. "You read my mind," Mac said with a smile.
"Well, I did see into your brain, so there is that," the doctor said, laughing at his own joke.
Mac just stared at him, not saying anything while the doctor chuckled at his expense. The doctor noticed Mac's sour response and pulled himself together quickly.
"Sorry," he said. "I don't get a lot of chances to laugh around here."
He waved his arm around the ward and then cleared his throat.
"Now that you're awake, we'll assess you to see if there are any long-term problems. You can clearly move your limbs and control them, so that's a big one. You appear to be able to talk just fine and process information, so that means you probably don't have any significant brain damage, which is also good. We'll put you through a battery of cognitive and physical tests and see exactly where you are."
The doctor paused for a moment.
"I'm not sure you can go back to your unit, Gunny," he explained softly, trying to lessen the blow. "Even if you pass all these tests. The fact of the matter is, you were shot in the head. You had to have brain surgery to remove the bullet. For better or worse, you've suffered a serious traumatic brain injury. You may make a full recovery, but you may have substantial problems that we don't know about just yet. My advice, after seeing tens of thousands of patients, is that you take things a bit slow. You can push yourself, but you need to focus on getting better. The war will go on with or without you. They'll win while you recover."
That wasn't exactly what Mac wanted to hear, but he understood what the doctor meant. "Do you know what happened to my unit in California?" he asked. The doc shrugged his shoulders.
"I'm honestly not sure, Gunny. I know there's been a lot of heavy fighting out there, but there's been a lot of heavy fighting all over the country. What I can tell you is that the Marines just landed troops along the Texas coast, and our forces in Colorado broke through the main Chinese lines. We seem to be turning the tide in the war, but that's about all I can say."
Mac nodded and thanked the doctor, who left to go attend to other patients. After the doc left, an orderly came by with a cart and asked him if he'd like something to eat. Mac hadn't thought about food just yet, but the smell coming from the cart suddenly made him incredibly hungry. He eagerly accepted the food. However, as he munched on a turkey sandwich and some cherry jello, all he could think about was figuring out a way to contact his old unit to see how they were doing. Chapter 24: Kidnapping and Mass Murder. Washington, D.C. White House. Situation Room. The director of the CIA, Marcus Ryerson, explained a horrifying discovery to everyone in the room. "Mr. President, there can't be any doubt about what's going on in the occupied zones. For months, the Chinese have been removing nearly all the healthy women between the ages of 16 and 35 and taking them back to China. We've had dozens of special forces teams on the ground providing us with video and still images of women being moved from central processing centers and sent back to China. One of our SEAL teams in L.A. managed to land a surveillance drone on one of the transports before it left California. The drone stayed dormant for a month on the journey to China. The NSA was then able to take remote control of it and provide solid footage of what was happening on the other end. They beamed footage back to a series of drones we set up to relay the information for about a week before the Chinese realized what was happening. During that time, we saw our American women being taken to large internment camps. What was going on in those camps we can't be sure of, but it's odd that they would only abduct the women from the occupied zones." Secretary of State Cagle chimed in. "I believe I know what the Chinese are doing," she asserted. All eyes shifted to her.
"Okay, why don't you explain what you mean by that?" the president asked.
She lifted her chin. "It's about their population demographics."
"You can't be serious," blurted the president's national security advisor, Robert Gray.
Undeterred, she replied, "Deadly." She then turned to the president, the only person in the room who really mattered, as she expounded on her proclamation. "The Chinese have a disproportionate number of men to women in their country. Frankly, they are about 70 million women short when it comes to single men of marrying age. This is a direct consequence of their one-child policy they had in place for decades. Not having enough women has created an unstable environment inside the country. I think our women are being taken back to China to be indoctrinated into their culture and will one day be given as brides to their conquering army." She was surprised no one else had put it together. Everyone looked so shocked. The president held a hand up.
"Whoa, that is a hell of a claim to make," he countered. "What kind of facts do you have to back that assertion up with?"
She pointed to the information the CIA still had displayed on the monitor. "Isn't it obvious, Mr. President? Why else would the Chinese have abducted hundreds of thousands of our women and brought them to China? The longer this war goes on and they maintain control of the captured territory, the more women they are going to kidnap and take to China." Everyone in the room sat there in stunned silence for a moment, digesting what she had said. Many of them seemed to be having a very hard time accepting this possibility. Finally, the president turned to General Marcus. "The Chinese are clearly carrying out a terror campaign in our country. They've kidnapped possibly 500,000 of our women, maybe more. We already know they killed several million more of our civilians and appear to be destroying every town and city they withdraw from. What can we do to bring this same level of fight and destruction to Chinese cities? I want their civilians, their people, to feel the same anguish and terror our people are feeling on a daily basis." Sachs had clearly lost his sense of restraint as the full scope of what was going on in the occupied zones became more and more apparent every day. People would be demanding vengeance as this information got out. Secretary Cagle jumped back into the conversation before the general could reply. "If I could, Mr. President, let me speak with my Chinese counterpart. Let me lay the cards on the table and let them know we know what they've been doing. If they won't agree to return our people and stop this genocide in the occupied zones, then I'll inform him that America will begin its own terror campaign, bombing high-density civilian populations all across China. Let me at least try to avert a further escalation if possible," she pleaded. General Marcus stayed silent. Based on what she knew of his views, Marcus hoped the president would heed her words. He, too, wanted to avoid escalating things if possible. If they could work out some sort of arrangement with the Chinese, then all the better. If not, then the Chinese would feel the weight of America's newest bomber, the B-21 Raider, as it rained death on their cities. Lima, Peru, Belmond Miraflores Park. When Secretary of State Haley Cagle's plane finally touched down at the Jorge Chavez International Airport, she breathed a sigh of relief. She'd never admit it publicly, but she was a bit concerned flying anywhere near a country where the Chinese military was in control. She could just see the headlines. U.S. Secretary of State's plane accidentally shot down by PLA forces. And that would thoroughly wreck her day. As the plane came to a halt, she looked out the window and saw they had pulled up near a large hangar and were being guided into it. Once inside, she saw dozens of diplomatic security officers and suburban SUVs waiting to greet her. When the pilot powered down their engines, one of the crew members disengaged the locking mechanism on the door and opened it. Next, some ground crew members moved a set of stairs to allow her to get off. The first thing she felt when she got off the plane was the immediate temperature difference between Washington and Lima. While it had been in the mid-90s in D.C., it was a cool 60-something in the capital of Peru. It was refreshing to be away from the stifling, humid weather of Washington, where the air felt sticky because it had essentially been built on a swamp hundreds of years ago. "Good morning, Madam Secretary. How was your flight?" asked her head of security. Secretary Cagle smiled warmly at the man who was charged with protecting her. It was not an easy job, given the Chinese had already killed off a third of the Congress and wiped out the Supreme Court at the outset of the war. "I'm doing good, Charlie," she responded. "Thank you for arranging this on such short notice." "It was no problem at all, Madam Secretary. The Peruvians have been exceptional hosts." His right hand gently clasped the shoulder of Mauro Medina, the Peruvian Deputy Ministry of the Interior. Charlie and Mauro had worked together in the past on a couple of other projects in Peru, Afghanistan, and Iraq, so he had a good working relationship with the man, even if his nation had decided to remain neutral in the conflict.
"It was no trouble at all, Madam Secretary,"
Morrow said with a laugh.
"When my good friend Charlie said you wanted to host a summit with the Chinese in my nation, I was elated and willing to do whatever I could to help make it happen. My government would love nothing more than for this terrible war to come to an end. We are still appalled at what took place with the United Nations. From the bottom of my heart, I am glad Peru never participated in that evil scheme against your nation."
Secretary thought his response appeared to be genuine. She sighed. "Okay, then let's get going to the hotel," she replied. "If possible, I'd like to get a couple of hours of sleep in a real bed before we have any further meetings. My understanding is the Chinese are going to be staying at the hotel as well, and they arrive tonight. I suspect they'll want to meet sometime tomorrow, once Foreign Minister Jiang Yi has had a chance to rest."
"Agreed. We'll get you to the hotel right away, then," Charlie responded. "Madam Secretary, President Tasso would like to meet with you tonight at his residence for dinner. He has some items he'd like to discuss with you if you are willing."
He guided her to the waiting vehicles as he spoke. Kegel paused for a moment and then turned to face the Deputy Minister Medina. "Tell the President I would be happy to meet with him tonight at his residence. That's very thoughtful of him. There are a few issues I'd like to discuss with him as well." The next 20 minutes went by swiftly as her motorcade made its way through the city. Then they pulled into the exquisite Belmond Miraflores Park Hotel, a beautiful 5-star lodging near the water. It wasn't a particularly large hotel, but it was ornately decorated and had several amazing conference rooms and side rooms the delegations could meet in to discuss the urgent business at hand. The government of Peru had gone ahead and taken the necessary precautions of booking the entire hotel. The only people that would be staying there would be the American and Chinese delegations, so talks could be held in private and without distractions. Once Secretary Kegel had had a few hours to sleep in the overstuffed bed of her exquisite suite, she got ready for her evening dinner with the Peruvian president, Mr. Pedro Tasso. When her car pulled up to the ornate neo-Baroque facade of the government palace, Secretary Kegel's head of security moved around the SUV and opened the door for her. As she exited the vehicle, she saw Tasso standing in front of the Capitol building with his wife, waiting to greet her. Kegel walked over to the two of them. They briefly shook hands as they exchanged pleasantries. The trio then walked into the grand entrance that led into a 2-level great hall lined with Roman columns, which was how they entered the Peruvian president's residence. Secretary Kegel followed Tasso and his wife as they wove deftly through the hallways. When they reached a doorway, the Peruvian First Lady excused herself. "I'll let you all talk alone for a while. There's about 90 minutes until dinner." Kegel tipped her head in deference to Mrs. Tasso, then walked through the door to the civilian patio. Kegel realized that she was joining a rare club, since this courtyard was only accessible from the residence, and Tasso was not known to take all of his visitors there. She liked the glazed tiles that adorned the patio with coats of arms. They stopped at a bench near the fig tree in the center. "Is it true that this thing was planted by Pizarro?" Kegel asked. Tasso laughed. "I don't know. But it sure makes a great story, doesn't it?" A steward came and brought them drinks. When they'd had a few sips, Tasso began the conversation in earnest. "Madam Secretary, I'm pleased that you are able to meet with me tonight. I know you must be tired from your long journey, and you have a lot to prepare for tomorrow." She smiled. "Mr. President, you may call me Haley when we meet in private. I prefer to keep things more personal and less formal when it's just the two of us." He nodded and quickly added, "Likewise, you may call me Pedro." "Pedro, I'm not going to play political games. We have uncovered some horrific atrocities being committed by the Chinese in the occupied territories of my country. I am here to meet with Foreign Minister Jiang to discuss this with him and attempt to convince him that these barbaric activities need to stop.
If you don't mind me asking, what kind of atrocities are you talking about?
Asked President Tasso. She proceeded to explain to him exactly what was happening. He looked disgusted and horrified that such an evil plan could be carried out against any nation. The sheer number of people that had been killed was appalling. After a brief pause, he asked,
So what is President Sachs going to do if the Chinese do not stop these terrible acts?
Haley paused for a moment, wondering how much she should reveal to him. Since she had been honest with him up to this point, she figured she'd tell him the rest. Should the Chinese not agree to end this vicious plan of theirs, then our president is going to exact America's revenge on the Chinese civilian population. His expression turned sad.
Didn't Sachs already do that? By bombing the Three Gorges Dam, though? Millions of people died during that terrible attack. Isn't that enough?
That bombing was in retaliation for the Chinese vaporizing our citizens and military facilities on Guam, Arizona, and Oklahoma. More than 400,000 Americans died in those nuclear attacks. Then, they used an enhanced EMP weapon on San Diego and Hawaii. She paused, taking a sip of her pre-dinner cocktail. No, this is different, she insisted. They are committing genocide on a massive scale in our country. It's estimated that more than 3 million civilians in California alone have been killed. She shook her head as she continued. This next round of attacks would be on the Chinese industrial centers. However, we are really hoping they'll stop this madness before it escalates any further. The Peruvian president urged caution in dealing with the Chinese, but also recognized that the U.S. would do what was necessary to protect its country and people. When they had talked a bit more, the rest of their guests arrived, and the dinner started. Secretary Cagle was fortunate that no one tried to pry any information out of her. It became a pleasant evening of breaking bread with friends, just talking about nothing and everything. The following morning at the hotel, Secretary Cagle received a message from Foreign Minister Jiang that he would like to meet for lunch so they could go over some bullet points for their conversation. He wanted to settle upon an outline for what they were going to talk about prior to their discussions. She sent a message back accepting the invitation and set to work preparing for a working lunch at noon. When Cagle walked into the formal dining room at the Belmont Miraflores Park Hotel, she saw Minister Jiang sitting at a table for 8, along with 3 other men from his delegation. Cagle, for her part, had only brought 1 aide with her to be a part of her delegation. From her perspective, there wasn't a lot to talk about. She was really there, more or less, to deliver a set of demands she knew the Chinese were most likely going to reject. When Minister Jiang saw Secretary Cagle, he stood and motioned for her to come join him. The two shook hands and bowed slightly. Jiang then held her seat out for her as she sat down. Jiang was always a gentleman toward her, even if their nations were currently at war. Under normal circumstances, she might be insulted by the gesture. But frankly, she and Jiang had built up a decent working relationship over the last 5 years. She knew he wasn't necessarily a Chinese hardliner, but he had his orders from Beijing, just as she had hers from Washington. "Madam Secretary, thank you for arranging this meeting," Jiang began. "It has been nearly 9 months since we last spoke face-to-face. We have lots to discuss." "I agree, Minister Jiang," she said with a nod. "We do have a lot to discuss. I know you had wanted to develop some sort of outline for our discussions, but if you'd be willing to, I'd like to just get down to business here and now and go over the specific reason I asked to meet with you in a neutral country." Jiang smiled at her bluntness. He'd been educated in America, so it was well known that he appreciated people who were direct and to the point. Many of his fellow countrymen would have been put off by Kegel's manner of speaking, but he just motioned for her to continue. Minister Jiang, I'm not going to mince words. Over the last several months, we have uncovered some very disturbing things happening in the occupied parts of my country. His left eyebrow rose in surprise. Really? He asked. We have done our best to accommodate your citizens that are now in Chinese-controlled areas. She smiled coyly at the comment. I wouldn't call eliminating the sick and elderly accommodating behavior, would you? She inquired. Kegel studied every movement of his facial expressions. His face flushed a bit, and his eyes darted down to the left as he responded. I am not sure I know what you are talking about. She was not at all fooled by his attempt to feign ignorance. Let's just cut to the chase, shall we? We have verifiable evidence in the form of videos and still images of sick and elderly people being driven off to mass grave sites in the occupied zones, she said forcefully. We have first-hand accounts of people who have escaped the occupied zones telling us of this as well. Worse, we have recently learned that your forces are kidnapping healthy women between the ages of 16 and 35 and sending them back to China. We've seen the re-education camps in China. You've systematically kidnapped citizens of our country and transported them back to your country. I understand this is war, but what your nation is doing is abhorrent. It's genocide of our people, and it needs to stop. You're calling China's actions abhorrent? Jiang asked indignantly. It was your country that bombed the Three Gorges Dam. Millions of Chinese civilians were killed, and tens of millions more were injured and left homeless. And it was your country that used nuclear weapons in Arizona, Guam, and Oklahoma, Kegel countered calmly. You then used an EMP weapon over Southern California and Hawaii. More than 500,000 Americans died in those attacks. You're lucky we didn't unleash our entire nuclear arsenal on your country. The two paused for a moment as they continued to eye each other. Finally, Jiang said, I am not aware of what you are talking about happening in the occupied zones. For all I know, you could be fabricating this as a way of trying to end this war. She shook her head in anger. She couldn't believe that he would try to obfuscate something like this. She turned to her aide. George, why don't you go take a smoke break or get a drink at the bar? She asked. I think Mr. Jiang and I need to talk in private. George nodded and got up. A second later, Jiang's people joined him as they headed to the other side of the room where the bar was located. Now that it was just the two of them, Kegel got up and moved to sit next to him so they could talk in hushed tones. Jiang, it's just you and me now, she said in a conciliatory tone. Seriously, what the hell is going on with these kidnappings and murders? Jiang sighed deeply. He pulled a device out of his pocket that made a sound like a waterfall. The white noise was a precautionary device to protect against listening devices. Haley, when this war first started, I did not know about any of this, he began. All I knew was what UN Secretary General Johann Baer and the others said was happening in America. It wasn't until the conflict had already started that I was filled in on my own country's involvement in this grand scheme. By that point, it was too late for even me to try and talk the president out of it. Once my country invaded yours, I heard about these kidnappings taking place, so I began asking questions. But this whole thing is very compartmentalized. Even I don't know everything. What I do know is it has something to do with what they're calling the Q program. She furrowed her brow. Q program? What is it? He leaned in closer to her. You know we have a serious shortage of women in my country. From what I understand of the program, the goal is to transport the healthy women of childbearing age back to China. As an incentive for joining the war and fighting in America, soldiers returning from the war would be given an American woman to be their bride. This would give an incentive for our youth to not only join the military, but to fight hard to earn the right to marry one of these women.
"Holy crap, Jiang! This is terrible," she said. Part of her couldn't believe it was true, even though this had been her theory. "Do you know how much of a pariah this is going to make China appear in the eyes of the world?"
I do. Sadly, I do. But this is way out of my control," Jiang insisted.
"Do you know how many women have been transported back to China?"
He shook his head slightly. "I do not have an exact number, but I know it is now more than 2 million.
She crossed her arms. "Look, I've been told to pass a message from President Sachs to your leader. If China does not stop this and return these women back to our country, he is going to launch a terror campaign on your cities, the likes of which hasn't been seen since World War II. He's going to order our bombers to systematically level your densely populated cities. He's furious at what's going on, and in his mind, if your military can do this to our people, then he'll do it right back to yours."
A look of despair and defeat spread across Jiang's face before he could resume his poker face. "I can relay the message to Chen," he replied. "But from President Chen's perspective, this will only fuel his message that the Americans mean to destroy the Chinese people. He has the media and the internet under so much censorship. The average person has no idea what's going on and has zero clue about this Q program. They'll continue to blindly support Chen, even if it means the end of China." She paused for a moment before she leaned in again.
"What can we do to convince the Chinese people not to support this war?" she asked, "to demand an end to it?"
Jiang snorted. "Keep doing what you're doing," he replied. "The casualties have been horrific. Even President Chen is having a hard time hiding them from the public. Eventually, they'll grow tired of their sons dying in a war far from their shores."
Secretary Cagle sighed. "What can we do to bring an end to all of this?"
Jiang cocked his head slightly to one side. "You could surrender," he replied with a smile.
"You can't be serious," she asked, not even trying to hide her laughter. "We just captured 200,000 Chinese soldiers in Colorado, and we're in the process of pushing your forces out of Texas. Why would we surrender now?"
Jiang quickly replied, "Because we've been letting you push us out of those areas. We've moved millions of soldiers into California. Soon, that army will be unleashed, and when it is, we'll control half of your country. If you want an end to the war, then you need to surrender now, and we can begin the process of disarming your military and population. America will become a protectorate of Greater China."
The two sat in silence for a moment, as each of them thought about what the other had said. Secretary Cagle came to the conclusion that for the time being, there wasn't really anything further for them to discuss. She had delivered her message to President Chen, and he had told her the only terms China would accept to end the war. There really wasn't anything more that could be accomplished. Turning to look at him, Secretary Cagle announced, "I suppose we should let the others join us again. We can at least have lunch together. But aside from that, I'm not sure there is much left for us to talk about."
Jiang nodded in agreement, and the two of them called their aides over so they could order lunch. The rest of the afternoon was spent making small talk, while they prodded and probed a few areas the two superpowers might be able to come to an agreement on, and ultimately, the Chinese had their end goal they were working toward, and America was never going to agree to it.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.